Okay, today is November 19, 2022. I'm going to title today's entry Close But No Cigar. In other words, what I want to talk about here is how I'm seeing in mainstream exercise where common sense is starting to creep in, i.e., you're seeing the influence of people like Arthur Jones, people like Drew Baye, people like Ken Hutchins, uh, coming into these things that Arthur Jones, for example, said a long time ago, and you can see their effect and whatnot on what is now being talked about in the mainstream. And what sort of inspired me to do this is one of my clients brought in an article from the Globe and Mail by a guy named is Paul Landini, and apparently he's a personal trainer. And there were some good parts about the exercise, about the article, but also some things that show, as I mentioned, close but no cigar. So I'm going to share my screen so that you can see it. Let's make sure I'm sharing the right screen here. And I believe I am. Hang on here. How can I tell if I'm sharing the right screen or not? I'm going to stop share. I'm going to go share screen, and I'm using either desktop 1 or desktop 2. So desktop 2, I believe this is okay, otherwise I'll have to start all over. So the name of the article is Globe readers asked me about exercise and aging, here's what I told them. Now, somewhere on the print copy here, it shows the guy's picture and it says opinion. So fair enough, it's this guy's opinion. So it starts out by saying, recently learned in 1799, life expectancy for pretty much everyone on earth, regardless of social status, gender, or wealth, was 40 years. Well, I don't know about that part about whether social status, gender, or wealth did make a difference or not. He doesn't show any references for that because an overall average is one thing. But anyways, today's statistics, 83 years in Canada, 73 years worldwide. I don't know if those are the accurate numbers, but we know that it's a lot more. You can't help feel an overwhelming appreciation for all that science and technology has done for mankind. And usually most of it, as Doug McGuff has said, if you want to thank somebody for longevity, you can thank a doctor, you could thank a capitalist because it's advances in that way that have made our lives easier. So anyway, it says, while medical advances in industrial enterprise, so good for him, he's giving credit, helped much of society live longer, easier, more fulfilling lives, this extended existence isn't a free ride and easy street. Preventative maintenance in the form of physical activity and exercise still required, or else the organic meat sack that we call our body can break down in any number of ways. So his first thing that he says is resistance training matters. Later on, he talks about stretching and he talks about cardio and that, but I like that resistance training is the first thing. When I first started exercising, about 45 years ago now, I was first influenced by a book by Kenneth Cooper called Aerobics. And one of the things about aerobics, which of course, if those are familiar, was very much about, heart and lungs. And he's the guy who first coined the term aerobics as an exercise modality. And at one point was called the guy who saved America's hearts. Later on, by some people, changing that to the guy who ruined America's knees. But one of the cruxes of that book had to do with, those bodybuilders, they're all muscle bound and all that those big muscles are just for show and maintenance, and they're not really healthy. As a matter of fact, it's hard on your heart. If you really want to be fit, then you have to work on the heart and the lungs, because that's going to be what's going to actually make you healthy and save your life. And which led to a little bit of tangent warning here, led to, I always find it interesting that you would compare a guy like a Steve Reeves, who looked like basically a Greek god. Steve Reeves, for those who maybe are younger, has played in the old Hercules movies and was a great physical specimen long before steroids made some of the bodybuilders become more grotesque. But anyways, and they would say, well, this guy's not healthy. And then side by side, you would look at some jogger who looked like sort of almost a Biafran who is being starved, and he's jogging and he's going really slowly because his knees are shot and things like that. And, you know, it's interesting how if something is repeated often enough, people believe it, that the former, this guy who looked like he was almost dying, would be considered healthier than Steve Reeves, who actually looked like the sculptures you see from the Greeks and things like that. But anyways, end of tangent. So, well, and so going back, so I credit Arthur Jones in many ways because not long after the 1968, I think, is when Kenneth Cooper's Aerobics was published. Somewhere in the early 70s, Arthur Jones started with Nautilus, and Nautilus centers started appearing all over the place, and all of a sudden muscle became cool. And around the same time, I have to give credit where credit is due, the movie Pumping Iron about Arnold Schwarzenegger and others also made muscle cooler. So today, though, resistance training is definitely not only looks good and things like that, but it is being recognized by the medical community, which of course Arthur Jones in 72 or 73 was saying that a long time ago. So here he talks about sarcopenia, and he says it begins to set in at around 30. Well, I did an earlier post where it says that it starts around 40. Now, he may have, of course, there's a link here. Let me just see where if this link is live and see where it goes to. Okay, so he does have a PubMed central thing here that I hadn't looked, and let me just see here. Yeah, so here it is. Muscle mass decreases approximately 3 to 8% per decade after the age of 30. So I'm glad I went to that link because here he says 3 to 5% of their muscle mass annually. So I looked at that, and you know, if I go here to a spreadsheet that I used previously in a previous post showing basically that amount, 8% per decade, and if I go to just 4%, which is, you know, sort of, he's saying 3 to 8, that's like ridiculous. So he's way off base on that as far as the amount. It says they don't know exactly why our muscles start to wither away and whatnot, but and the prescription is the same for all but the most competitive of athletes. In other words, the implication here is if you're a competitive athlete, you're going to train differently. 2 to 4 sessions of total body resistance training on a weekly basis, which each session lasting between 20 to 60 minutes. So I got to give credit or due here. So 2, as we're saying here, to 4, I say 4 is excessive for the vast majority of people, but 2 is less than recommendation. So again, when I say, you know, the influence of people like Arthur and Drew and Ken and others comes in, I see a lower amount here. Weekly basis, and also between 20 to 60 minutes. So the 20 minutes is again very brief compared to what is being done. I also see this as an influence. But then he says, you join a gym, hire a trainer, find some class or online programs. And this is where, unfortunately, he says, doesn't matter how you do it, just find a method you don't hate and stick with it. Okay, just find a method you don't hate and stick with it. That just leaves it open to all sorts of dangerous practices. Now, mobility training also matters. So it says, being able to express your body's fullest range of motion and having the confidence to move in and out of challenging positions is just as important as preserving muscle mass. So I'm going, why? Why do I need the confidence to move in and out of challenging positions? I just need enough mobility to do my activities of daily living. And so I would question why you even need to have that, unless, of course, you are participating in a sport, or you're a dancer, or you're a gymnast, or things like that. But for most people, why would you need to do that? Just as important as preserving muscle mass. No evidence is given here for why that would be just as important, which I question. Now, he says some pros, whatever that is, a pro, argue that when done properly, lifting weight itself is a form of mobility training. So again, I'm seeing the influence of Arthur and others in showing that, when you're lifting weights, that it does help you with your flexibility, because strength, as people like Drew and others have said, is the one thing that really is going to influence all the other parts of what's often referred to as fitness, including flexibility. But then he says it's the done properly part that gives me pause. Most people don't even know how to walk properly, let alone lift weights. Well, that's interesting, because the done properly part, because above here, he just finished saying, doesn't matter how you do it, just find a method that you don't hate and stick with it. Then here, of course, he's saying people aren't doing it properly. Well, following his advice. So, and in a low risk environment, 10 to 15 minutes a day is all it takes. Yoga provides a great avenue for this. Another method is becoming popular. So I'm not going to make this too long by going all these various things, but yoga, I have a client who used to be a yoga instructor who has injuries as a result of over holding stretches. And I have another client who works in a physiotherapy office who said you'd be surprised how many people come in with injuries they got from yoga. Then, of course, he goes to cardio training matters too. All right, so without getting into the whole cardio definition on that. But anyways, the final component of training for a long, prosperous life is as simple as a stroll around the block, which is interesting because as is becoming more and more obvious that you don't have to do very much. You should be active in between your strength training sessions, but definitely. So he says, maybe it's a jog, a bike ride, or a hard hike through the wilderness. My point is, despite popular depictions, cardio training need not be a torturous log on treadmills and the like. So I'll even go a step further and state for the record, unless you plan on entering the Boston Marathon, a detailed cardio training program probably isn't necessary. So again, I'm seeing influences here from more sensible sides. Aiming for 10,000 steps a day. So, all right, 10,000 steps a day to me is a completely arbitrary number. Maybe there's some science behind it that I'm not aware of, but I don't see it. But you should have some activity. As I've said in previous entries, I think my Fitbit has a thing that says of my waking hours, how many of those waking hours did I get up and move at least 250 steps a day? I think that makes more sense, because I think some of the earlier stuff, like going back to Ken Cooper's aerobics book, one of the examples he used, I remember this, was that there were double-decker buses in England, and there was a guy who sat and drove them all day, and there was a guy that went around collecting tickets. And they showed that the guy who drove the bus, these guys tended to have more heart disease than the guy who's going around doing the tickets. So to me, then they turn around and say, well, then people should move, and the more you move, the better. And they had this whole point system, and the more you do, better. And in the meantime, ruining your knees in the process. Well, I think this 10,000 steps a day is not, I don't think it's so much that the guy carrying the tickets was doing something good as the guy sitting around not moving all day was doing something bad. So if you're getting up regularly and moving around a little bit, I think that's fine. But here is, again, the way this guy writes is that he says 10,000 steps a day, whatever, on top of engaging with the outdoor world on a frequent basis, as possible, is often enough for maintaining. Okay, all right, so I unread that. I thought it was on top. So however many steps, and getting fresh air, fair enough. Being fresh air, I won't give him any grief on that. That's fair. And then he says, that is, of course, unless you love cardio, in which case I say have at it. Just make sure to leave room for resistance training too. So this is where, again, I'm seeing this. If you love it, and we're talking about exercise versus recreation, somebody enjoys running, fine. But he doesn't state it as resistance per se, or sorry, as recreation. He just says, have at it. Well, to me, if you love cardio, do however much you want to do. Let me rephrase that. Do it knowing that you are putting your body through wear and tear. Do it knowing that you are interfering with your recovery between your strength training workouts, so try to moderate how you do it, try to do it properly, and also keep in mind the wear and tear. So, and then don't forget about lifestyle. So here he talks about how people ask often and give advice that it's different for different ages, different genders. So I agree with this. He says seniors need the same 7 to 9 hours of nightly sleep. I agree with this. I've always been skeptical of the idea that you need less sleep as you age. And then, of course, the balanced diet: lean protein, whole grains, fiber, and healthy fats. Here, there's a typo. So I don't know about too many whole grains, but at least he's got protein first here. And so, yeah, so that's good enough for this article. So then I thought, well, I'm going to check out and see if I can Google this gentleman and find his site. So sure enough, here's his personal training site. And the very first article that came up is Training to Failure. So I'm thinking, wow, all right, that's cool, more influence. So I'm thinking maybe there's something to this. Now, so first of all, he says anyone who studied basic exercise physiology can tell you that not going to be adapted unless it's challenged. So not up for debate. So it says training for failure is the special sauce that makes muscles grow. But then he says, what's the definition of training of failure? When is a set of push-ups complete? Is it when you're face down on the floor, arms quivering, completely gassed and swimming in your own spit and sweat? Or is it a few reps before that? So personally, I see failure as a breakdown of technique. So, all right, fair enough. I would say that sentence stands okay, because you should do as many perfect reps as you can. If you can't do them perfectly, if you have to compromise your form, then that's a very bad thing. So I don't like seeing people grind out ugly reps for the sake of chasing failure. Well, I guarantee those last reps are garbage. Well, then you should be coaching people to do good reps. And all the body learns from that approach is how to adopt compensatory motor pattern, how you learn how to move poorly. And of course, Tommy Kono being awesome. See, there's a picture of a guy here at the top part of a snatch, which I don't know why that would have anything to do with a personal trainer, anything like that. That sort of a sport that has nothing to do. So, but he quotes him, practice makes permanent. I tell all my clients to keep a rep or two in the tank for this very reason. So rather than say to people, do as many perfect reps in the tank, do as many perfect reps as you can, he says, let's keep a rep or two in the tank. As long as they're working with enough intensity to challenge themselves, that's what's most important. So this reminds me two things. Study that was done, I can't remember if it's James Fisher or James Steele from United Kingdom, might have been both of them, where they did this thing about the rating of perceived effort and asked people to train within their estimation of 1 or 2 reps short of failure. And then later on asked the same people to train to failure. And what they found was people were notoriously bad at judging 1 or 2 reps short of failure. So, what does that mean? Keep a rep or 2 in the tank for this very reason. And then it says, what happens if you reach the end of a prescribed rep range and find you're not sufficiently challenged? It doesn't say how you should figure that out. So treat that set as a warm-up, add some weight, and start over. So this just doesn't make any sense to me, that why not just do the set right in the first place? The other thing too that I'm reminded of is Jay Vincent. Is it Jay Vincent? He did a video where he's showing, I'm going to have a mental block here. Hopefully I can add it into the notes. This one researcher, who's one of these guys that always espouses volume over one set, and geez. But anyways, he shows the guy in the video. Look for Jay Vincent. So he look for a video on his site that talks about, and I'll try to link to it, that talks about somebody who's talking about training to failure, because the one guy says, okay, you do multiple sets, but you do one of the sets to failure. But then he shows a video of him training, and what that guy is calling failure sounds like what this author is also referring to, because it's nowhere near actual failure, because, you know, as soon as it starts to bog down a little bit, they stop. Now, I do understand that training to absolute failure is not necessary to get results. It's just that, you know, trying your best, again, going back to what has often been said, is it's very hard to measure almost failure. So anyways, again, here he says, prescribed range, if you're not sufficiently challenged. Treat the set as warm-up, add some weight, start over. If calisthenics are your jam, progress to movement to a more challenging variation. Again, why not just do it right? And then he says, move from a split squat to a skater squat. I don't even know what a skater squat is, but split squats, I mean, I think enough has been said about that, that it's an unsafe exercise. Just remember, don't increase the challenge too much. You need to accumulate a sufficient number of reps when training to failure. How many? What's the sufficient number? Why reps does that count? Doesn't say. Otherwise, you won't trigger the necessary adaptations. So maybe, I guess you could say, if you're just doing 1 rep maxes, fair enough. But he doesn't say how long the reps are. And here is a decent rule of thumb. If you can't do at least 5 reps, the exercise is too challenging. Well, 5 reps at what speed? There's nothing here about how fast the reps are. And as usual with a lot of this, pushing sets past the point of productivity is not. So it's kind of like he starts off this part about how training to failure is a special sauce, and then he goes on to sort of kind of do it. So anyways, like I say, I do see a lot of influences here. There's pictures of kettlebells here and things like that. But again, I would still say close, maybe even not close, closer, but still no cigar. And but the encouraging thing is that I think slowly but surely it is starting to make its way into the mainstream. And of course, eventually, no mention here is given credit to where the idea of training failure came from people like Arthur Jones and things like that. So it's reminded me of the stages that truth goes through, which is at first it's ridiculed, which of course is what the Weeders and whatnot and Schwarzenegger would make of Arthur Jones training. Then it's violently opposed, so people try to discredit it. And then finally, it's accepted as self-evident, which we're starting to see that in the scientific literature. It hasn't seemed to be made its way into general practice by any stretch. But the fourth one that people hear less is, then they say it's their idea in the first place. So, you know, I'm sure at some point, some researchers will come out and say they've discovered that training to failure is right, and forget that Arthur Jones, and probably people before him, I don't know that he was the first guy to do it, certainly the first guy that I know of that popularized it, trained to failure. Anyways, just thought I'd do a bit of a critique on this, show how some common sense is sneaking in, but still a long way to go. Thank you for listening. Thank you for anybody who subscribes, sharing, comments are always welcome. Bye for now.